Welcome to our webinar today. We're going to have presentations about two approaches to reduce food waste. And these are lessons learned from US EPA Sustainable Materials Management projects for Region 5, which happen to both be in Ohio for this particular round of funding. I'm Brian Rowe at Ohio State University. Welcome to everybody. I will soon turn you over to Julie Schilf from US EPA Region 5 to give a welcome and an overview about things happening at EPA. And then we'll turn to Corey Mansell from the Center for Ecotechnology to talk about a project that they have in the Cincinnati area. And then I'll take back over around 1:45 and share some results from the Save More Than Food campaign evaluation in Central Ohio, suburb of Columbus. And then, time permitting, we'll go back to some general Q&A and discussion about overall topics and trends. But I am going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Julie. Julie, you ready to take over and share your thoughts with us?
I am. Give me one moment here.
Sure.
To switch over. And switch again. Okay. Y'all don't want to look at the side of my head. I'll look over there. So thanks, Brian. I really appreciate it. Can you hear me okay? All right, great. Thanks for having me. For those of you who don't know who I am Julie Schilf. I work in the EPA Region 5 office, and I am the coordinator for our Sustainable Management of Food program. Today, I'm going to talk about some funding opportunities. First, I'm going to talk about regional funding opportunity, which is informing our webinar today. And I'll talk about two anticipated national funding opportunities that are coming up very soon. So first, I would minimize the screen. I'd like to talk about the grant that funded the two presentations for today's webinar. These projects were funded by a regional SMM grant opportunity. That's our Sustainable Materials Management Grant Program. Now, we don't offer this grant consistently. It really depends on budget and funding year over year. But when we do receive enough funding to hold a competition in the region, that grant opportunity usually offers more than one priority area in order to make that opportunity more attractive to a broader pool of applicants. So that's why you'll see here in this list that I'm sharing with you today of our most recent grant recipients. And CET and Sueco from our fiscal year 2020 grant cycle is who we'll hear from today. Both received funds to address food waste in Ohio. And we also funded a group called RTI International for plastics work, which is also being done in Southeast Ohio. So all of our FY20 grants went to work directly in the state of Ohio. And I think that's actually really amazing and noteworthy. Most recently, we were able to hold a grant competition last year, and we funded CET again in order to expand their work out of Southwest Ohio and across the state. We also funded a nonprofit group out of Detroit called Make Food Not Waste. And they are actually an NRDC Food Matters Great Lakes cohort participant as well. And they're working with restaurants directly to provide technical assistance to reduce wasted food. And then we also funded the Michigan Recycling Coalition and the University of Illinois at Chicago for their work with recycling markets. Now, we won't be holding a grant cycle this year in the region, unfortunately, but it's okay because not because of this exciting national funding opportunities that are on the horizon. And I'm going to talk a little bit about those now. So first, a little bit of background though. Over the last few years, there's been an amazing amount of congressional support for recycling. We've had over 20 legislative proposals related to recycling and food waste reduction. Some of that legislation has recently been passed in 2020 and 2021, which have directed EPA specifically to develop a national recycling strategy with targeted circular economy strategies on plastics, food waste and organics, and electronics, just to name a few. Now, I want to take a moment to point out, because this is a food-focused webinar, right? I'm going to take a moment to point out that we are expecting the draft strategy for food loss and waste and organics to be available for public comment in the next few weeks. So keep your eyes peeled for that opportunity, because it does feed into these grants that EPA has been directed to issue in order to support the broader recycling and education efforts in communities across the US. I do want to take a moment to point out also, I think it's important really to note, that EPA's vision and direction through these strategies and grants is really to embrace circularity and SMM with the purpose of addressing climate change and environmental justice. So I want to give a little bit of background and a nod to that, so you have an idea of what our vision is moving forward as well. So with that said, we are so excited about this historic investment of $350 million for solid waste infrastructure and recycling grants, which will really help transform our recycling and solid waste management across the country. I want to first talk about the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which has directed us actually to hold two grant programs. One is the Solid Waste Infrastructure for Recycling Grant Program, which gives us a total of $275 million or $55 million a year for the next 5 years. And we have the Education and Outreach on Waste Prevention and Recycling Grant Program. And we have been given $75 million to administer that program. We expect the request for applications for both of these programs to be issued later this year or in early 2023. And I really want to encourage you to sign up at this link to receive updates and info as it becomes available directly out of our headquarters office. That way you'll be right on top of all that information as it comes out. Now I'm going to talk about each one very briefly. No, this is just a brief comment and intro to these grant programs. So first, the Solid Waste Infrastructure for Recycling Grant, or what we're calling it is the SWIFR, is, as I said, $55 million a year for 5 years. The goals of this program are really to support improvements to recycling programs, to support our overall waste management infrastructure, and to support how we manage post-consumer materials across the US. Eligible entities for this grant program are states, the District of Columbia, federally recognized tribal governments, US territories, and political subdivisions. And by political subdivisions, I specifically mean local governments. So states, local governments, tribes, and territories are eligible for this grant funding. Our next steps, and actually right now, we are collecting stakeholder and public input to help us inform these grants. And I'm going to touch on that in more detail in a couple more slides. So first, I would now like to talk about the Education and Outreach Grant. As I said, $75 million or $15 million a year for the next 5 years. These funded projects should inform the public about residential or community recycling programs. They should really provide information about recycled materials that are accepted. And we really hope to increase participation and collection in recycling programs and also decrease contamination. Entities eligible for this funding include state, local, and tribal governments, but also this funding also includes nonprofit organizations and public-private partnerships. So that's really interesting and a nice expansion on those eligible entities. Now, our next steps, first is to develop a model recycling program toolkit for communities. And we are also collecting stakeholder and public input to help inform this grant. Now, the language in the legislation for the E&O grants, the Education and Outreach, I call it E&O, is much more prescriptive than it is for the infrastructure grants by specifying these following types of projects that are eligible for funding. I thought this was important to share because it can really give potential applicants an idea as to what this funding, what you may be applying for in the future. And keep in mind, food and organics as a part of that circular economy strategy series are included in that. Food and organics is as an important strategy under the series, kind of feeds into both of these grant programs. So think about that in terms of education and outreach as well. So like I said, EPA is currently collecting stakeholder input and feedback on the development of these grant programs. If you are in Region 5 and your community or your organization is interested in providing us with input, you can email my colleague, Susan Vescovi. She's done a really amazing job at organizing group feedback sessions, or you can shoot me an email and I'll work with you and Susan to set something up. If you're not in Region 5 and you're attending this webinar and would love to provide stakeholder input, reach out to your regional EPA Sustainable Materials Management person. If you don't know who that is, you can send me an email and I'd be happy to connect you with the right person. Now, most importantly, I really want to encourage you to check out all of these links. First and foremost, stay connected. Like I said earlier in the presentation, you sign up for these notifications through the Stay Connected link. I encourage you to read the recycling strategy to learn more. Within that strategy, you can lead or support an action identified in that strategy. So please read through it and sign up to take an action. And I encourage you also to check out the infrastructure fact sheet that we have specifically for recycling. And if you have any questions beyond that, you are free to email this address and someone from headquarters will get back to you. And that's all I have. Just a little bit of input here.
So Julie, there is one question I'll pose to you from the Q&A box. Are there target regional geographic areas that you'd like to focus your grants upon?
Well, the grants, so headquarters hasn't really worked out how the grants will be disseminated. I do know that the education and outreach grants are competitive in nature, but I'm not sure how the Swiffer grants will be designed. But this money is for the whole country. So headquarters hasn't really worked out yet how that's going to work.
Great. And there was a request the Stay Connected link be dropped in chat when you get a chance after.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, for sure.
You're quite helpful to many.
Yeah.
Awesome. I'm just monitoring for any other questions in the Q&A or chat. I think that gets to most of them. Yeah, I think that's it.
Thank you.
Awesome. Well,
I'll drop my email address in the chat too. Sorry, Brian.
Oh, no worries. Yeah, that sounds great. With that, we will transition to our first speaker of the day. Corey Mansell is a client services strategist for the Center for Eco-Technology, where she organizes and develops stakeholder engagement and outreach initiatives to support waste reduction programs, conducts presentations on public-private partnerships and food waste reduction strategies, and provides on-site advisement and coordinates direct technical assistance to commercial entities and institutions across the US, among many other things. And we're excited to have her present about their project. So take it away, Corey.
Great, thank you for having me. And you can see my screen all right? All right, so thanks again for having me. I'm Corey Ann Mansell, as noted earlier, client services strategist at the Center for Eco-Technology. And I'm very excited to share some of the highlights from our work specific to Ohio, which was with support from EPA Region 5. Okay, so for a bit of background, our organization, the Center for Eco-Technology, or CET for short, is a nonprofit that helps people and businesses save energy and reduce waste. And for over 40 years, we've been helping businesses and institutions implement programs on the ground while also contributing to and implementing effective public policy on these efforts. So we're really looking at what's happening on the ground and what are those policies and programs that can facilitate a marketplace and help everyone. We do this work with many partners, and partnerships are critical to making this impact happen. Listed here are some of the government agencies, utility companies, foundations that we partner with to make this environmental change happen. And as a nonprofit, we do seek funding through grants, as well as offer fee-for-service contracts and accept donations. If you are joining us today, you may already be familiar with the importance of reducing our wasted food, but I did want to include this snapshot in recognition of the 40% of food that is produced in the US that is intended for consumption and not eaten, which equates to about 20 pounds of food per person per month. And this is at the same time that we're facing food insecurity in the US. So in addition to this need in our communities, we're also looking at that cost and the loss, the economic loss of wasting the food, and then also, of course, the negative impact on our environment. Since 2013, when we launched our Wasted Food Solutions program, we've been able to help reduce, recover, and divert wasted food from disposal, which of course, as I noted, positively impacts our communities, our environment, and our collective bottom lines. And one clarifying point is we're not a solution provider per se. So while we're not a food rescue organization, a composter, a anaerobic digestion facility, we are there to provide tailored recommendations and facilitate matchmaking with those that have surplus to those that can reduce, rescue, and recycle it. I want to, of course, specifically thank EPA Region 5, as well as our partner solid waste management districts in Southwest Ohio, including Adams, Claremont, Butler, Hamilton, Montgomery, and Warren. It's been a pleasure working with all of them, and we're very thankful for their interest and participation in this phase 1 effort. So what you came here to learn about today or hear from me about is what was encompassing of phase 1 project. So with that support from EPA, we created a marketplace analysis for the Southwest region of Ohio per request of our local partners, including the 5 solid waste management districts that I mentioned. And this analysis was or considered a SWOT, so an analysis of the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats within the food waste marketplace. And it provided a critical foundation for the following objectives: hosting workshops that narrowed in on those opportunities and encouraged connections, offering no-cost technical assistance to facilitate program implementation, and then sharing those successes to inspire others. And at the end of the day, our objective is to increase knowledge, expand capacity, and facilitate those connections across the EPA food recovery hierarchy, which ultimately improves food security, creates jobs, and preserves our land quality. So the analysis encompassed a comprehensive look at the policies, the infrastructure, and the actors that support that marketplace, and identified, as I noted, those strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats that will grow its function. We interviewed over 30 stakeholders, which included opportunities for feedback from our partners and was vital to the understanding of the marketplace and where we can be most impactful. Here is some highlights of the SWOT. So for instance, we noted the sustainability plans and ongoing efforts that were already in place as a strength, but also recognized the need for additional processing capacity for handling food scraps as a potential weakness. We also saw opportunities to further highlight preventing food waste as a cost-saving measure and recognized the interest in networking and peer-to-peer learning. However, this grant did go into effect in that 2020 realm, so COVID-19 certainly impacted the marketplace in more ways than one, and there were some regulatory and marketplace concerns, such as marketing finished compost and the liability concerns for donating safe and edible food that we wanted to work through. Thinking about that timeline showcased earlier of the next phase of looking at those workshops that can build those connections and provide a platform for conversation. So after we completed the SWOT, we hosted a series of workshops on a few topics with a few sectors of interest. And here's an example of a workshop invite. We organized 3 workshops thus far, and across the 3 workshops, we had over 300 registrations. We also organized a series of meetings for food rescue organizations across the region and across the state. This was to foster collaboration and connections between these entities. We acknowledged that we wanted to encourage folks to lean on one another and work together to feed more people. And we recognized that there are so many inspiring models both in Ohio and beyond. So it's a great opportunity to connect with peers and ask questions. So as one example, we heard that managing inedible donations can sometimes be a concern, as well as how to sustain volunteers and how to build relationships with the local community. So at one of the recent food rescue agency meetings, we had the food bank in Dayton present on their on-site industrial composting system, which noted how they're processing those inedible food scraps. We had La Soup highlight strategies to build donor and volunteer relationships. And we had Loaves and Fishes from a Virginia-based food rescue organization speak to ways that they're building community partnerships. And as part of this process, we're continually asking for feedback from these agencies and these food banks so that we can continue to host meetings that bring the content and the learnings that we're really that they're seeking. We also hosted an on-site workshop in August of 2021, which was hosted by the Food Bank in Dayton. It was actually offered both virtually and on-site and included a tour and overview of their on-site industrial composting operation, which is an earth flow shipping container and has been running since 2019. The food bank is actually saving a notable amount per year on waste disposal, and the compost previously that was being purchased for their urban garden. And since the inception of this operation, it has diverted over 100,000 pounds of food waste from the landfill. And the compost product is nearly sufficient to supply the food bank's 40 garden beds with nutrients that will help continue to build an educational experience as well as a community building experience on site. And as a licensed Class 2 composting facility by Ohio EPA, they can also accept food scraps from outside sources and distribute their finished compost. And we encourage this as a workshop because we recognize that it can be an exciting model for food permitted businesses. We've seen corporate cafeterias implement similar systems, as well as the partner solid waste management districts that we're looking for learnings or examples to point to, and then also for those other food rescue organizations that might be looking to process that inedible food that sometimes occurs. And we are continuing to offer opportunities for no-cost waste assistance, which is a vital piece to all of these services. So we can meet with food permitted businesses and institutions in person or virtually via Zoom, FaceTime, what have you, to conduct walkthrough assessments of a facility, kitchen, or office building. And then this leads to measurable impact with literal tons out of the waste stream because we're providing custom recommendations for implementing programs. So the custom recommendations report includes a reflection of what we saw because we want to recognize what is going well and what could be expanded upon, as well as other opportunities to prevent, rescue, and recycle wasted food. It's essentially a roadmap to implementing the programs that are going to best align with their facility based on the solution providers that might be accessible to them and who might be that right match, as well as the best practices for administering those programs, really looking to how can we encourage long-lasting, successful program adoption. The last thing that we want is somebody to try it out and feel as though, nope, I never want to go back to that. It didn't work out for me. We really want to set a solid foundation from the very beginning. To help inspire others to adopt and expand their own programs, we also featured a number of businesses across the region. This does include the Food Bank of Dayton, which I was realizing when I was making the slides. They're a great partner, and it was a pleasure working with them, as noted from the numbers of times that I've highlighted them. And also Jungle Gym's Marketplace, the Finley Market, the Cincinnati Zoo, and Mad Treat Brewing, which some of these entities might be familiar to attendees here today. And we'll be promoting these stories on social media in the coming weeks to build that momentum and in recognition of their hard work. I wanted to highlight one of the sector spotlights as an example. So, for example, the Cincinnati Zoo really facilitates food waste reduction, recycling, and food rescue programs within their 3 cafeterias. And we helped advance the communications between the zoo and their third-party food service vendor called SSA. And the zoo utilizes a HARP 6X5 biodigester for their on-site composting system, which is capable of processing about 1,000 pounds of organic material per day. And this clean organic feedstock that is collected for the zoo's composting operation really requires diligent use of the food scraps collection bins. And so we worked with the zoo to raise awareness of the program to address bin contamination that was preventing ultimately the full capacity of the full use of their system. And recognizing that communications are vital to the success, we incorporated and provided recommendations on how to facilitate additional trainings and just help it be part of their onboarding process and continued recommendations and training at the zoo. So also we looked at what are the customer facing bin areas, source separation stations, as well as what are the ones in the back of the house that are more tailored to staff. And so how can we right size those bins, as well as right size those signs, as well as thinking about those visual cues. And then also they're expected to continue to expand in early of their 2022 season, which will bring this system to full processing capacity. And also I wanted to recognize that not only are they composting, but they're also working with food rescue organizations such as La Soup, and we helped them reestablish that program with that food rescue organization, and also establish a new relationship with the Society of St. Andrew, a gleaning organization with potential flexibility to pick up additional surplus from their operations. Here's a snapshot of our phase 1 impact thus far. And then I'm very excited to note that we're continuing this work in Southwest Ohio, as well as beyond across the state, really taking those learnings from this year and furthering those efforts, expanding upon those, and hopefully doubling this impact next year or this year. And of course, so here's a few snapshots of the assistance that we're providing in phase 2. So for instance, we're going to continue to host food recovery working groups, which offers an opportunity for food rescue organizations and food banks to continue to come together, build connections, and get more food rescued. We received positive feedback in phase 1 with these meetings, so we wanted to continue to facilitate that. And then also we will have 1 or 2 meetings that are building conversations and addressing concerns around composting. So more to come on that. But we did see, also heard positive feedback from the workshop that we hosted at the food bank in Dayton. So we'll take some of those learnings and see where we can go from there. I wanted to reiterate the no-cost technical assistance that we're able to provide. So we're going to continue to offer this service to businesses and institutions across the state. And if you're an attendee and would like this no-cost support, please please do reach out. Or if you are an attendee and you can think of any networks that can distribute this call to action, that would be also greatly appreciated. Here's a snapshot of, again, some of the assistance that we can provide when thinking about no-cost waste assistance, recognizing what's going well and what can be adapted, looking at customized waste bin signage and right sizing of containers, and looking at that cost impact analysis, as well as much more. And we will also be developing some new resources. So one, for example, is working with the Cleveland Department of Health. We are developing a quick guide and best practice document for food donation, which can be available to their health department inspectors and distributed to businesses that inquire about their donation opportunities. We're not saying that it's going to be part of the inspection process. It will just be a tool in the toolbox to reference if there are questions, so that we are encouraging those that are interested in these programs and want to work with their community to rescue their surplus food. In addition, we're also creating a document that further highlights the business case for reducing surplus food, which, for lack of a better word, is an addendum to Hamilton Resources source reduction incentive in their district. And because we acknowledge that even though there's all this data and information around the importance of reducing our food waste, we really wanted to build a tool that speaks to our peers. So thinking about food permitted businesses, what's really going to resonate with them. We, even as a consumer, you don't really want to admit that food waste may happen in your own kitchen, but how can we make it, pull out some quotes and stories of that doesn't point fingers and really just recognizes, oh, I was so excited by the fact that I was able to upcycle this product into something new, or I was able to reduce it from being wasted on a continual basis. So those are some of the resources that we're providing and what we're going to be doing in phase 2. We don't want to duplicate efforts. We want to partner with districts that have programs or are looking to work together, and we're really excited for this work, and there's a lot to still learn on the way. So thanks again for having me speak today. I'm happy to take any questions if there are any.
Yeah, Corianne, there's lots of interest, great presentation, lots of good questions here in the Q&A and in the chat. Let's see here. Let me start off with, do you plan to expand in Cleveland? It looked like some of your slides alluded to that.
I wouldn't say necessarily a plan. We do want to be supportive to the programs that already are in place, or if there is interest. So I did call attention to the work that we're doing with the Cleveland Health Department and facilitating more resources around food donation. So if you are interested in partnering, feel free to reach out.
Great. Someone had asked as well, are there agencies in Columbus that are working to collect individual food waste? And I think this was for recovery. And I had answered that Food Rescue US at least had a installation in Columbus. I don't know if they survived COVID or not. Hopefully they did. But do you know of others? And I think Jane is also typing in an answer here as well. But
there are other models of food rescue organizations and food banks that do have on-site systems, or working with animal feed, because we also recognize the EPA food recovery hierarchy. And if there's opportunities to connect with animal feed operations, that's also encouraged and adopted. We were focused in the Southwest region, so that's why we did have the food bank in Dayton host their system.
gotcha. And Jane, did you have a Columbus connection on that front, maybe?
You know, I actually assumed the question was about organics haulers, not about rescue. So I did include a response that there's a number of private haulers, but if that's not what's being asked about, then feel free to ignore that.
Thanks. So back to you, Corianne. Question here, do you know how much of the 75 tons that you mentioned being diverted went to composting versus prevention, i.e. not wasted in the first place?
Yep, we do note that in our impact report that we send to EPA. I didn't write that out in the slide here today, but we did have a notable um, amount of tons go to prevention strategies as well as rescue, and then of course composting. So we hit those three tiers of the hierarchy.
Great. Any idea of the blend of those, or pretty equal, or?
I was just looking at the numbers earlier today, but I don't want to misspeak. So if there are further questions, I can put my contact information and I can follow up, certainly.
Gotcha. Yeah. There's a request for you to drop your email into the chat at some point as well. Corinne, how are you deciding on partnerships, approaching potential partners directly, putting out a call and waiting for orgs to approach you?
It's a hybrid approach. Some of it is based off of reference. We are a national organization. We did start in Massachusetts, where we developed and now administer recycling works under contract by the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection, and it offers a similar suite of services. And in the past 7 years or so, we've seen an increasing number of states, cities, partners reaching out to our organization to kind of looking at, what worked well, how can we work together? But as I noted in the slides, we don't want to be duplicative. We want it to be a two-way street. So partnerships can look varied across the country, whether it's looking at just resource building, looking at the complete suite of services of that no-cost technical assistance, as well as just sharing our process and learning from those that are also helping businesses and institutions implement programs.
Great. Another question about Cleveland. Dayton and Cincinnati programs are impressive. Do we in Cleveland have anything similar?
We just started our work in Cleveland. There are, I know that there is exciting opportunities and momentum in the marketplace of looking across what's happening with, I think Food Rescue US is also in Cleveland, which is an example of food rescue organization, and as well as a number of organics haulers. So I'm excited to learn more about what's happening and continue to work with the health department and potentially businesses that want to look at the solutions.
Great. Now I'm jumping over to the chat. Are there written materials available from the compost workshop that can be shared?
We usually record our workshop, so we might have that one our workshop recorded, which is available on our Wasted Food Solutions website and the state-specific resources for Ohio page. I can also drop that in the chat, and it's not necessarily a written document, but it is a recording of the workshop.
Great. Another question: what was the capital cost of the mechanical composter unit located at the Cincinnati Zoo? Kind of operating cost per month. People very interested in these things. Yes.
Yes. My colleague is the one who facilitated those recommendations, so she would probably have that off the top of her head. I do not. And I would, again, that's another question that I'd be happy to follow up on.
Yeah, there's another follow up on that. If the zoo's machine is a HARP renewable or one similar to the one used by Earth Peak Organics.
It is a HARP system.
Okay, great. Are you working with any organization in EPA Region 2, like Rochester area? Are you available to work with professional engineering firms in that area?
We actually do have support from EPA Region 2 to do work in New York and New Jersey currently, as well as from EPA headquarters to do some focused work on anaerobic digestion. So I would be happy to connect with folks there in New York. And it is looking at a similar suite of services where we will be developing resources that will be most impactful for the marketplace and administering the no-cost waste assistance.
Great. Just checking for any other questions here. Someone complimented you on using the term wasted food rather than food waste, which, yes, I think that is, we try to use that nomenclature as well. And someone said, when I worked at a food company, compost company, their saying was, don't waste it twice, which seems like a clever turn of phrase as well.
Yes, if you don't mind, I'll just jump in there and comment. One thing, when I'm working with businesses, I frequently say, why pay for that food twice? In the sense of just wasting it out the door. If you might as well put it to a higher, more beneficial use.
Great. And I think that got us through all of the questions. Last call for questions. Either drop those in Q&A real quick or chat. Otherwise, I think we will give you a round of applause. Great presentation, exciting work, making impacts in Ohio and elsewhere. So thank you, Corey.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Okay. All right, I am gonna try to move over to my presentation. I think we're like almost spot on time, which is just remarkable. So who would have thought we'd be on time? Not necessarily me, but I'm happy we are. Let me get my slides up here. And let's see, someone verify that everybody can see this? Awesome. All right, well, from one Region 5 project to another. So I'm excited to share with you some results from our evaluation of the Save More Than Food campaign. I'd like to recognize some key collaborators, many of whom are on the call today: Ying Xu, Jane Karetny, Kyle O'Keefe, Katie Reese, Lucy Schrader, and myself. We're all pretty motivated here on this call, so we are well aware of the opportunities that exist with reducing food waste. Sueco, one of the key partners in this study, did a waste characterization for Central Ohio and found about 1 million pounds a day going to landfill in Central Ohio. This really motivated them to convene the Central Ohio Food Waste Initiative, which involved over 60 partner organizations and led to a development of a food waste action plan for Central Ohio. And as part of that, this created the Save More Than Food campaign, which we'll talk about here. And you see some of the materials on this page. Again, developed with partner and general public feedback and focuses on the reasons that food waste is important to people and provides actions to reduce food waste, along with a very nice set of campaign materials. So with funding from EPA Region 5, Sueco applied for and then worked with ourselves at Ohio State and City of Upper Arlington to implement and test the Save More Than Food campaign. And so a lot of our focus today will be on Upper Arlington, Ohio, a suburb of Columbus, right near OSU campus, for those of you who might be familiar with it. And so our goal was to evaluate the effectiveness of this on several different fronts. Now, the evaluation approach that we chose goes by kind of a fancy term here, difference in differences. Many of you are probably familiar with a simple before and after approach to evaluation, where you would do key measurements, maybe amounts of food waste, reduction, awareness, et cetera, before, and then after the implementation of a campaign. Best practice usually dictates you also have a control group. And this illustration here suggests why that can be very important. If you can also then measure a control group before and after, you can then tease out more specifically the effect of the campaign. So for example, here, if we just done a before and after with this blue line, the treatment group, we would have seen a very large effect, but it would have been ignoring a kind of a secular or perhaps a seasonal downturn in the outcome that was being evaluated. And so yes, it would appear that the implementation of the program did have an effect, but not nearly as large as without having a control group in your evaluation. And so by taking the difference between the control group and the treatment group, both before and after the implementation, you can get a cleaner, more robust measurement of the effect of the campaign. So for our study, we had to decide on the control group. One approach we took was to divide Upper Arlington into 3 areas, largely organized by the day of the week that their waste was picked up curbside. And then we used different campaign materials in these 3 different areas. And we treated the area that received the least intensive campaign materials as a control group. This is not a perfect approach, as oftentimes this is a very small community, and so there's going to be spillovers between the treated areas and the control areas. And so there could be some, we might not fully trust this approach to using a control group. A second approach that we used was to then draw a national sample of households, and they received some similar measurement as did the Upper Arlington group, in this case, a online survey for self-reported amounts of wasted food. Now, the weakness here is the people taking that national sample, national survey may have different motivation for responding to that survey than do our local residents of Upper Arlington. And we also don't have any curbside audit data for the national sample, just too expensive and too difficult to organize. But we have these two sets of control groups that we'll use as part of this evaluation approach. All right, so we have these three different areas in Upper Arlington. Treatment area 1 received, in addition to the base materials, some more intensive material about improving food storage to help reduce food waste, including refrigerator magnets, even the offer to be able to get some free blue apple pods. These are pods that you can put in your refrigerator that help keep fruits and veg fresher for longer. We then had an area that received both those materials plus some pretty intensive materials about composting. How do you do it? And again, offers of free materials for liners that could be used for drop off of food waste or even a backyard composting machine. And then our control group received many of the same communications in order to just give a general awareness of the Save More Than Food campaign materials, which helped emphasize steps to reduce food waste in their own homes. Our data collection approaches, this centered in 2021. In late winter, early spring of 2021, we did our before efforts, and then the campaign ensued late March, early April through the beginning of summer, and then we went and did our after measurements in the mid to late summer of 2021, using both waste audits, so curbside measurements of waste that were on their way to the landfill, as well as self-report via survey of both food waste, and then we would capture data about their knowledge, their attitudes, other behaviors, and again, that self-reported food waste generation, where there we could also get our national sample responding to many of those same survey items. So when we went out to the nation, we used Qualtrics, a vendor that helps collect, curate national panels of consumers. And the survey in each time period involved a baseline survey, just some screener questions, their consent to participate, some demographic questions, and then basically a heads up, hey, over the next week, please monitor any food that you're creating in your household that ends up being discarded. And then about a week later, a survey that would ask them about the food that they may have discarded and the causes of that food waste, and some questions about knowledge and effort. In Upper Arlington, a very similar approach was used, although recruitment was via US mail and social media. And there were some additional questions asked both on the baseline survey, including some differential questions during the summer. And then on the follow-up survey, we had asked more specific questions about the Sueco campaign, the Save More Than Food campaign, and some additional questions about attitudes, prevention, etc. Not surprisingly, the national survey and the Upper Arlington group were different in terms of the demographics of these groups. The Upper Arlington respondents were typically younger, had more formal education, larger households, higher income, more full-time employment or student status, and more identified as white non-Hispanic than the national sample. So we adjust for many of these factors when we do our analysis to understand any differences that might have occurred between the national and the Upper Arlington samples. So some first results of this, we turn to that self-reported survey-based measurement of food waste. And here we see On the left-hand side of the visual, we've got two bars for Upper Arlington, one in the spring, the before measure, and one in the summer, the after measure. And we see that there was a 23% reduction from spring to summer among the self-reported waste created in Upper Arlington, self-reported. On the right-hand side, in contrast, we see an upward movement from spring to summer, about a 29% increase in food waste, which is not unusual. Most surveys suggest there is typically more wasted food in households during summer than spring. And so the difference in those changes, or the difference in difference, is about a 52% change or difference in the trends before versus after in these two groups, suggesting that the campaign may indeed been effective among those who are involved and volunteered for this particular survey. So that's one sort of evidence for effectiveness of the campaign. When we take a deeper look at this data, we noted that in that first before contrast, folks in the US reported, if we go back to that, we noticed that Upper Arlington reported about 311 grams per person per week. Nationally, it was less, about 270. So why do we have that difference? Well, it turns out when we dive in, we ask people to report in about 24 different categories. And we can note how many categories of waste that they report. And we do note that in Upper Arlington, people were reporting more categories of waste in general. For example, this blue portion of this stacked bar is the number of people who reported no waste. And we see at the national level, typically more people reported no waste. Now, once they reported some waste in a category, though, for the most part, people reported about the same amount. So the way the survey works, you say, did you waste anything in fresh fruits? Check that box. And then you'll have another question asking you, okay, how much did you waste? Once they marked that they did have waste, it was typically about the same across our 24 categories. 18 of them had no difference in the amount of waste, given that somebody marked it US versus Upper Arlington. There are about 5 categories where the national sample actually reported more waste in particular categories. Fresh fruit through cheese, and just soup was the only one where the nation reported less food waste in that category when they reported waste than Upper Arlington. So our conjecture here is that Upper Arlington participants were a bit more motivated to report categories with small amounts of waste, but once in a category, the waste amounts were generally the same or slightly higher for those at the national level, which makes sense given that Upper Arlington participants probably saw this as being involved in their community, and perhaps they were a bit more motivated to think more deeply about all the categories of food that they wasted. Now, when we look within Upper Arlington at different areas, we have the control area that received just minimal messaging, and then the treatment areas that received either food storage or food storage and compost. We see both had downward trends. The control area actually showed a 44% decrease in waste. The treatment area, 9%, though these are not statistically significantly different from one another. Even though the numbers are quite different, there's enough noise in the data that it's hard to call that statistically distinct. So it does not appear that the more intensive use of campaign materials led to a significantly larger decline than just the kind of the base control level of materials being shared in Upper Arlington. Now, when we move from the survey out to the curbside, where we actually physically collected food waste and measured it by scale, we find about a 21% overall reduction between spring and summer in terms of the amount of food waste. And this is being reported in grams per household rather than grams per person, because we didn't have the number of people necessarily per household for all of our data at the audit level. This included about a 30% reduction in inedible food scraps, and then a 17% reduction amongst once edible food or wasted food. And recall, that's not that different than the 23% reduction measured by a survey. So we're having some convergence in the amounts here. Now, when we break these out into our two groups, here In the middle are the group that got the control treatment, and the group that didn't get any group that didn't get any composting materials is in the middle. And then on the far right, those two are the before and after for the group that got the really intensive composting materials. We do see here that we do see a big reduction in once edible food among those who got the composting materials. About a 53% reduction and about a 42% reduction overall. So we do see a little bit of differentiation here within Upper Arlington among the audits, particularly for that group that got the heavy composting information set. Also, we'll note that much like most other research in this area, we do find that the survey underestimates the amount of wasted food compared to that collected by waste audit. Here you can see the differences. It's more than twofold larger when measured by audit than by self-report. Very similar to most other work in this area. If we look at the types of foods that were being wasted, here we're looking at just the once edible portions for both the audit and for the survey. Produce tends to dominate. A third to a half, depending on whether it's audit or survey, are the items that are most prevalent in the waste streams. Leftovers come in a distant second in the audits, dry goods a distant second in the survey. And so one of our tentative recommendations is to consider focusing interventions on produce waste reduction. We do recognize certain communities might not have access to fresh produce, and therefore this might not be an issue. So obviously we need to be considerate of the community as well. In terms of one thing that's always tricky about evaluations is that typically we have to rely upon volunteers to self-report on surveys or to let you go into the individual curbside waste streams to audit that. And so one always wonders, are we just getting a strange group of people who are willing to let us look at their garbage or report about their garbage, and maybe they're just fundamentally different from the overall people who are in the entire community. So this was our attempt to try to deal with that. So we have here audit data. And what we did is after the volunteers, we went out and grabbed their garbage before the pickup of garbage on their particular day, both before and after. We would then go to the garbage truck that got all the rest of the garbage, and we would grab a 300-pound sample from that truck and also do an analysis from basically all the non-volunteers in a very similar street or area of Upper Arlington. And we did that both spring and summer, and these are the data broken down both by the wasted food, the once edible food, and the inedible food scraps. And so the big punchline here is that our volunteers and our non-volunteers had very similar fractions of their waste streams attributable to wasted food and to inedible food scraps, both spring and summer. And indeed, we actually find, again, reaffirm in here that there's a decline in the amount of inedible food scraps from spring to summer among those volunteers. That's mirrored by our non-volunteers as well. So we do have some evidence that the volunteers are not terribly different in terms of their composition of their waste compared to the non-volunteers, at least in Upper Arlington. So jumping back to the survey, we also wanted to understand how awareness was affected, because the Save More Than Food campaign was rolled out about 6 months prior to us going into Upper Arlington. And so there was a little bit of awareness of the campaign in spring before. About 6.5% of individuals had some awareness of the campaign, but by summer, that went up considerably to over 40%. So a very strong increase in awareness. Now, there wasn't much difference between the control and the treated areas. These increases a little bit bigger in the treated areas, but not statistically larger than in the control area. Again, suggesting that the campaign was effective in both control and treated areas. The perceived effectiveness of the campaign was significantly greater in the treated areas versus the control areas. And there was marginally statistically more success in the response to, do you think the campaign created actions to reduce food waste in the treated area versus the control area? And finally, we found both paid and unpaid materials had strong impacts on creating awareness. The table on the right shows the community newsletter had perhaps the most mentions in terms of awareness. The mailed materials, which were quite costly to put out there, were also highly effective. Email materials also were effective. Facebook. So we see a blend of paid and unpaid materials driving awareness here. We also assessed attitudes pre and post within Upper Arlington on the survey. Didn't find a lot of change in attitudes. These 11 statements here in all their gory detail are there for you to take a look at perhaps later if you want to, but only 2 out of those 11 questions yielded any statistically significant treatment effect or change over time between treatment and control areas. And there wasn't just a lot of change in these much at all between spring and summer. So not a lot of change on the attitude front. Same thing for food waste knowledge, not a lot of change in food waste knowledge pre versus post in Upper Arlington. And also with waste prevention precursors, actions that might lead to waste prevention, shopping with a list, creating a meal plan, not a lot of change between spring and summer, and no real differential effects between treatment and control areas. So some change, some significance in some areas, but not in others. One thing that did change, Upper Arlington has a drop-off composting program, and here we see the poundage taken away from that drop-off program over time. In blue in 2019, when they started tracking this, down around the 1,000 to 2,000 pounds collected every 2 weeks. 2020, it inched up a little bit as they added more sites. But then in 2021, right after the campaign began, we saw a pretty strong uptick in participation in this. Now we'll note they had been having some capacity issues throughout 19 and 20. And right before the campaign started back in February, they actually increased the frequency of pickups to alleviate some of the capacity issues. But when they increase the pickup frequency, we don't see any uptake. But then as the campaign hits here where the black arrow points to, we do see a strong uptick in participation in this. The survey also backs up some of this, seeing more increases in composting activity from spring to summer as well. So in conclusion, as we kind of let all that data kind of soak through us, and we're as a writing team still trying to let all that data soak around us as well to really think about this pretty deeply, we think that we can conclude that the campaign did yield significant changes in the amount of food wasted, food diverted from landfill as measured by the audit, in compost drop-off program participation, as we saw that big uptick in pounds being hauled away, and a significant decline of self-reported edible food waste for both the treated and the control areas in Upper Arlington, and residents' awareness of the overall campaign. We also see a strong treatment effect of the campaign on that self-reported waste if we consider Upper Arlington in total as the treated group and the national survey as the control group. But oddly, there were no or very few significant impacts on residents' knowledge, waste prevention practices other than actual reduction itself, or attitudes about food waste. Some of the recommendations that we have tentatively queued up here are to keep supporting community level implementation of the Save More Than Food campaign or other similar campaigns. Working with Upper Arlington and enjoying their very involved activity in this. We recognize that deploying the campaign through trusted community actors is very important to make that campaign come to life. To consider community-specific traits when deploying food waste reduction and diversion efforts. We'd like to do it all. We'd like to do it all immediately, but we realize that sometimes these will have to be phased in. And so it's going to be very important to think about the community's capacity to implement composting and or its ability to reduce food waste in their households. Given the prevalence of produce, both in this study and many other studies, we're suggesting that focusing behavior change efforts on the purchase and use of fresh produce might be a way to start. Now, obviously, if your community lacks fresh produce, which some do, then this might not be a priority. And then ensuring sufficient capacity to meet any increased demand for food waste diversion is also important. So if you promote composting, you want to make sure that people have a way to actually follow through with that. And then some recommendations for researchers as well. But with that, I'll stop for questions and see what types of questions we might have. All right. Let me go to the Q&A. What made you go with a new campaign rather than an existing campaign like Save the Food? Let me see here. We do have folks here from Jane. I don't know if you feel comfortable answering that. I know Kyle would probably be the best suited to do that. We might be able to find him on the participant list. And Kyle, can we get you to, let's see if we can get you to unmute here. Kyle, I don't know if you're able or are still with us, but if you have any comments on that. I know that was a big question that was asked at some of those very early meetings. But if you would have any comments on that, it would be helpful to share those now.
Sure, Brian, I can chime in. Yeah, great question. When we started the campaign, we were really trying to find a way to localize our campaign, make it really connected to Central Ohio, some of the impacts that we're seeing or that are occurring in Ohio, and a lot of the solutions that we point to may be specific to our region as well. So that was part of the impetus for creating our own campaign and something that could be managed locally and that we could also massage and change and evolve over time that we felt aligned with our strategies and programs. So that was really the purpose is this localization of messaging and tactics.
Great. Thanks, Kyle. Appreciate that. I know it's always a struggle. Do you do something novel where you're going to and localize where you perhaps get more buy-in from the community, or do you not reinvent the wheel and use something off the shelf? And I know that's a very typical struggle that's out there. Another question, assuming the UA survey questions mirror the national survey, do the national survey measure any changes in behavior before and after the interventions? We actually, I don't think we had as many questions about behaviors on the national survey. Because we pay on a per panelist basis, we try to keep those surveys a bit shorter. And so we didn't do as deep of a dive on that, but that might be something good to do in future work. All right. If the survey showed there was no change in knowledge and attitudes, what drove the reduction in waste? Yeah, great question. I mean, there is a sense that, and you get this from the quote unquote nudge literature, where sometimes people's behavior can change just with suggestion or priming behavior where you don't have to engage the entire cognitive process. So that's our hypothesis here, is that particularly in Upper Arlington, I think people were open to and willing to change behavior, and it didn't really necessarily need going through the entire awareness attitude precursors to get there, just perhaps a reminder, and for the composting side of things, a reminder or awareness of how to undertake that. And so that's our kind of working conjecture that might be what was at play here in Upper Arlington. But
Yeah,
great question.
I can add in, so it's the possible ceiling effect, because a lot of them already think they know some sort of knowledge or attitudes are already pro, reducing food waste, but just not as high as we wanted. So the marginally small, the very small increase is not really significant, but that could create actions on the other side because they know this, but they didn't do it. But the intervention actually helped them and monitoring more or help reducing more food waste.
Thank you, Ying. And Ying has been thinking deeply about this for over a year now as being one of the key researchers on the project, and part of his dissertation work is this study as well. Are there considerations for doing a similar study in other Columbus neighborhoods, particularly ones with not as many resources as UA? That's a great question. I think we're open to that. It does require some funding to get things rolling. So I think at Ohio State, I think we'd be open to supporting work in other neighborhoods, because I think that is a critical question to see if similar types of needs and responses might be there in lesser resource communities than Upper Arlington. So, but it takes a constellation of coordination between the municipality, researchers and funders to make that all come together. So I think many of us are open to it. Jane?
Yeah, I can chime in quickly. We aren't necessarily doing full-scale research in other communities, but we are rolling out a lot of the interventions that took place in Upper Arlington. We've put together into something we're calling a community toolkit, and we're rolling out this community toolkit in partnership with different communities across Central Ohio. So we're currently working with Gahanna, who's going through the process right now, simultaneously as they're launching a food waste or food scrap drop-off site. And so there is conversation about potentially trying to do something this year in Columbus as well, with specific intention on selecting communities that may not have the ability to purchase that kind of service on their own. So hopefully we will be able to get the chance to develop some of the messaging as well as it pertains to different communities and collect research on that. I also wanted to add just a note on the last question about, how do we explain the change in behavior without a perceived change in personal knowledge or, beliefs. What I've heard again and again from folks who have worked in recycling for a very long time is that when activities become a social norm, when recycling became a social norm, even if folks didn't necessarily understand the full usefulness of recycling, they adopted the behavior as it became the right thing to do. And now a very commonplace thought that people have is that recycling just makes sense. So it is possible that just by providing the infrastructure to compost, the thinking around recycling transfers over to recycling food scraps.
Great points. Thanks for sharing that, Jane. And jumping back into the Q&A, do you think areas with lower income will affect the food waste? I mean, how will this affect study results? Yeah, I think that's a very relevant question. And this is something that Jane and the other study members and I have gone back and forth on is, what does this look like in areas that are food insecure? Will the waste streams be smaller, different? There is some evidence over many studies that food waste does tend to increase with income. That's not an ironclad finding, but there's a general tendency in that direction. So we might think that food waste will be less in food insecure communities, not terribly surprising, and those streams might be somewhat different. So I think we do have to think critically about our food waste campaigns as essential, or do they need to be customized differently for communities with different resource bases, different food eating patterns, etc. So something we need to be cognizant of. And then Andrew, Andrew, do you want to, can I find you and unmute you as well and let you respond to that? I think we still have a few more minutes here. You'll be up at the top. There we go. Go ahead, Andrew, if you could chime in with your comment and question.
I don't have much more to add than what I commented in there. just similar to what Jane said, just simply that, there can be this kind of general impact of these messages, whether it be food waste reduction, composting, recycling, what may have you, where it does kind of seep in basically in a more general sense to a person's understanding or motivation, even if they can't necessarily recount the specifics of what they've learned. So it was really just kind of supporting Jane's comment.
Thanks for sharing that. There's a couple over in the chat as well. Did we look at protein waste such as meat? We did both on the survey and in the audits. And again, a very small fraction was in this vein. Obviously, it has a very large life cycle impact, that meat. So even though it might be a small proportion in terms of the environmental impact, it might be larger than its weight proportion. The reduction during the summer is surprising to me. I would think that melon rinds, corn cobs, etc. Yeah, so that is typically why nationally and seasonally there's typically an increase from spring to summer. And so it is even more remarkable that we found that reduction in Upper Arlington from spring to summer. You had talked about Upper Arlington's local government municipalities involvement. Will Upper Arlington be continuing awareness and hope to keep decreasing food waste? Just wondering if they are empowered to continue after your involvement. And Katie and or Jane, I don't know if you guys want to comment on that.
I'd like to hear from Katie.
Yeah,
Putting
I
you
can
on the
comment
spot,
on
Katie.
that. Yeah. So yeah, so after we started our drop-off sites, and then as we continued with the campaign and the survey, we've seen an increasing participation and interest in food waste. And so most recently, what we've done is we got a grant from the USDA to start a curbside pilot. So we're actually in the process of starting that pilot right now. And we've had really good results so far. So we just started in the last month, but we've already had, I think we're over 600 households have signed up saying that they're interested in participating. So yeah, so between with the campaign and the survey and everything, we've seen a lot of interest in this. So we are going to continue with that.
And I'll add that we've had conversations, Katie and us at Sueco, about how to continue the messaging around food waste, food scrap, food organics prevention. And so, we'll be continuing to think about how to add on to our Save More Than Food community toolkit to continue on that messaging beyond the short period of time that it's currently meant to be implemented over, so that folks can continue to get that kind of messaging during the holidays, for example, or peak times where there might be a lot of extra food that they're dealing with.
Great. I was going to see if Julie, if we could put you on the spot, if you have any comments now that you've, no, I just saw you in chat. Great presentations.
Yeah, great job by everyone. Thank you. Sorry. I have a question for Jane. I'm wondering if you can describe in more detail what the contents will be in that toolkit, and if that toolkit will be available to other people outside of your area.
Yeah, I mean, so right now it's not on our website yet, but we've been openly sharing it with communities who are interested in partnering. So I don't see why we couldn't make it available to everyone. It currently is made up of social media posting and messaging guide filled with all sorts of messaging that we've developed for use by communities in their messaging about the local activities that are going on, and just to speak of the various resources that are wasted when food goes to waste. There's flyers that can be personalized with community logos, newsletter and press release templates, and a lot of just communication materials that are meant to promote whatever the community is working on in the food recovery space. And then as part of these community partnerships, we're also offering things like webinars, and we have a grant program at Sueco that helps communities launch drop-off sites for organics collections. And so that's another piece of the toolkit that if the community goes for these grants, we help promote in these various materials. So it's primarily like a promotional campaign around wasted food and how to prevent it in the home or any other in any other environment that a community is interested in focusing in on.
Thank you. And really thanks to you and CET for your great work and final reports on this funded work. So, we really appreciate it at Region 5.
Julie, we appreciate Region 5 support. I'm sure that I'd speak for Corey and the whole team here in Central Ohio as well. I'm going to do one last scan for questions and anything in the chat. And Corey, do you have any comments that you'd like to bring up now that you've seen both presentations as well? Just want to make sure.
Great job, all. One kind of broad comment is, how we communicate and encourage our consumers to reduce waste. It also applies to the business sector. So it was exciting and great. I was taking notes as these presentations were going through because many of these strategies can also be applied to the businesses, and also when thinking about cafeterias and K through 12 schools as classrooms as well.
I'll promote some. So Ying spoke briefly earlier. Part of his dissertation work is also he surveyed many restaurateurs from around the country. Ying, do you want to talk a bit about some of the work that's forthcoming from your dissertation?
Yeah, so I've been mainly focused on restaurant food waste. So what I do is I split that waste into the front of house material and food waste. The other one is the back of house food waste. So the way I do it is I want to assess how restaurant manage the waste, how the waste are generated, and any ways we can quantify the waste into actionable and non-actionable waste for more targeted waste reduction efforts. And the other highlight in my dissertation work is I used something called discrete choice experiment to learn what restaurateurs value some attributes of the food waste and approaches. So one approach I focus on is this newly introduced food waste management system that can help you weigh the food, weigh the item, get the recording of the item, and analyze the item. And with the more data you have, they can kind of start to provide you with monthly report or weekly report to help you guide a better forecasting of the material you want to use. So to reduce the food waste that caused by the error in the planning, everything like that. And there's many attributes related to that. And I want to study how they value it, so they can one way is to inform the makers of this kind of machineries to better target restaurateurs to make them want to use it. And the other one for the front of the house is I want to learn how they value different approaches to compostable or reusable takeout materials and sustainable tablewares, how much they want to provide, stuff like that, and how I also use the discrete choice experiment to evaluate their willingness to pay for all these attributes. So
how many different restaurateurs did you survey? I forget.
Oh, yeah. So for the back house, I have 75 samples. It's a very costly survey. We have to find actual restaurateurs. So it's the cost was high, but I have 75 for the back house and 75 for the front of house. And by combining the two, I actually have 150 for all the food waste related items, because I have that same question for both samples, but just different discrete choice experiment.
Mm-hmm. And we'll build on some of his work and some work of a colleague of mine we'll be working on some ideas for simulating out actions that restaurateurs can take to make their entire presentation more sustainable, both through reductions in food waste and through choices of menu items, to see how these can affect their life cycle assessment of their entire business and their profitability, as well as the health profile of their customers, taking into consideration that some customers, for example, don't like it when you serve less meat. So we'll take into those considerations as well. So that'll be work forthcoming from our group as well that we'd love to share at a future webinar. but I'm going to do one
That's-
last scan for questions and answers.
Yeah, I'll jump
please.
in really quick and say, first of all, I'm really excited for that research because that'll really help inform the type of outreach that we do to businesses, which is really just starting up. We've been really focusing on residents so far. So I look forward to seeing that. And if anyone is interested in becoming aware of the resources that we currently have on Save More Than Food, the website is just savemorethanfood.org and has resources, again, for residents as well as some for businesses. We're still building those up, as well as materials for educators and food waste reduction in schools. So I'll go ahead and put that link in the chat.
Great. So with that, I think we've probably exhausted all the questions in Q&A. I'd like to thank our speakers again today, and most importantly, EPA for funding this work.